Somewhere in the Aegean, a trireme is moving at full speed. 200 men are at the oars. They have been rowing for hours. They are not stopping to cook. The crew eats as they row. Some of them sleep in shifts. They are racing, and most of them know what they are racing against. Another ship left yesterday. It had a full day's lead. It was moving at the ordinary pace of a crew with no particular reason to hurry. Because that first crew didn't know they were actually in a race. They were carrying a death warrant. The men on the second ship were carrying the pardon. Last episode, you heard Cleon, and if you set aside the moral distaste of what he proposed, you may have noticed something unsettling, that the argument was not incoherent. Mercy in the imperial context is not necessarily kindness. It is an invitation to be tested again. The allies in the Aegean are watching. Every city in the Aegean is calculating its odds. Gamble on revolt or stay with Athens. If Mytilene pays no real price for rebellion, calculation changes everywhere. The assembly had already voted once, in collective rage, to endorse the punishment. Now, they were being asked to vote again, in the cooler light of the following day. And remember that Cleon had laid a trap for anyone who would argue against him. He said that anyone who spoke in opposition was either a sophist showing off their rhetoric for vanity's sake, or someone who had been bribed. The man who rose to oppose him was not a famous general, not a celebrated statesman, or a figure of aristocratic prestige. The man who stepped forward was Diodotus. He appears here, delivers one of the most sophisticated political arguments in ancient history, and then vanishes from the historical record entirely. We know almost nothing else about him, only this speech and the fact that it worked. Before we hear Diodotus speak, we need to understand the assembly he was speaking into. It is 427 BC. Athens has been at war for years. Pericles, the man whose voice you heard in earlier episodes, gave the funeral oration, who told the Athenians that they were the school of Greece. He is dead, taken by the plague that swept through the city. That plague killed somewhere between a quarter and a third of the Athenian population. It killed soldiers, it killed citizens, gutted the treasury, and it removed the one political figure who had the authority and the trust to keep the assembly from its worst impulses. In his place, Cleon. This is the man that Thucydides seems to despise. He calls him the most violent man in Athens. Now, the case for Mytilene was special, as we mentioned in the last episode. The whole island of Lesbos, where Mytilene was situated, had a special status in the Athenian Empire. It was one of the last truly autonomous allies. Not a subject state paying tribute, but a free partner contributing ships instead. This meant in practice that when it decided to revolt, the betrayal stung in a way that someone that only paid tribute would not have. Athens had treated Lesbos as an equal, and Mytilene, or rather its oligarchic government, had used that freedom to negotiate with Sparta, Athens' bitterest enemy. The revolt was oligarchic in origin. The common people of Mytilene, the demos, had not wanted it. And when the promised Spartan fleet failed to arrive and the siege dragged on, the defenders of Mytilene made a desperate gamble. They armed the people for a sortie against the Athenians outside. The people took the weapon and then promptly refused to fight and mutinied. So the democratic instinct, even in a city mid-revolt, proved stronger than oligarchic ambition. And this matters enormously for Diodotus' argument, which we will return to soon. Now, what the Athenian assembly knew when it gathered for this emergency session was that the city had rebelled, and that the prisoners and their people were now in the Athenian hands. They also knew that the death warrant was already on its way, traveling with a ship dispatched yesterday. Into this assembly stepped Diodotus.
I do not blame the persons who have reopened this case, nor do I approve of the protests which we have heard against important matters being frequently debated. I think that two things most opposed to good counsel are haste and passion. Haste usually goes hand in hand with folly, and passion with roughness and narrowness of mind. As for the argument that we have heard, that speech ought not to guide actions, the man who uses this argument must either be senseless or self-serving. Senseless if he believes it possible to navigate an uncertain future through any other means than open debate. He is self-serving if, knowing he wants to push through a disgraceful plan, but at the same time is doubting his own ability to argue for a bad cause. He thinks he can just scare the opponents and listeners with well-aimed slander. What is even more intolerable is to accuse a speaker of putting on a show just to be paid for it. If a speaker were only accused of being ignorant, they could lose the debate and still walk away with their honesty intact. But when you charge someone with dishonesty, they are suspected of corruption if they are successful in their address, and if defeated, viewed as both a fool and a rogue. A system like this would not benefit Athens, because the fear it would create would rob the city of its advisors. In fact, if our speakers are to make these kinds of wild accusations, it would be better for the country if they could not speak at all, as we would then make far fewer blunders. The good citizen should win a debate not by frightening his opponents, but by beating them fairly in argument. And a wise city, without over-distinguishing its best advisers with excessive honors, will nevertheless not deprive them of their due, and far from punishing an unlucky counselor, the city will not hold him in disregard. In this way, successful speakers would never be tempted to sacrifice their true beliefs just to ride the wave of populism in the hope of higher honors, and unsuccessful speakers would not feel forced to use tricks to win over the crowd. This is not our way. Besides, the moment that a man is suspected of giving advice, however good, from corrupt motives, we feel such a grudge against him for a bribe we are not sure he will receive, that we deprive the city of a certain benefit. Honest, good advice has thus come to be no less suspected than bad, and as a result, a speaker advocating the most monstrous measures is no more forced to use deceit to win over the people than our best advisers are forced to lie just to be believed. Owing to these clever suspicions, our city, and our city alone, can never be served openly and honestly. Someone who does serve Athens openly is always suspected of secretly serving himself. Still, considering the magnitude of the interests involved, we orators must make it our business to look a little further than you who judge offhand, especially as we, your advisors, are responsible, while you, our audience, are not. For if those who gave the advice and those who took it suffered equally, you would judge more calmly. And it is, whenever the whim of the moment leads you into disaster, you blame the single person who advised you, instead of yourselves and your numerous companions in error. However, I have come forward, neither to oppose nor to accuse in the matter of Mytilene. Indeed, the question before us is not their guilt, but our interests. Even though I hold them guilty, I shall neither advise their death unless it is expedient, nor if they should have claims to mercy shall I recommend it, unless it be clearly for the good of our country. I believe that we are deliberating about the future more than the present. Where Cleon is so positive as to the useful deterrent effect that will follow from executing rebels, I, who consider the interests of the future just as much as he does, argue for the opposite. I urge you not to reject my practical considerations for his baseless arguments. His speech may have the attraction of seeing the more just in your present anger against Mytilene, but we are not in a court of justice. We are in a political assembly, and the question before us is not one of justice, but how to make the Mytileneans politically useful to Athens. Now, of course, nations have sanctioned the penalty of death for many offenses far lighter than this. Still, hope leads some to take the risk, and no one ever puts themselves in peril without an inner conviction that the plan will succeed. Was there ever a city that rebelled without believing that its own resources or its alliances were up to the task? All of us, states as well as individuals, are alike prone to make mistakes, and no law will prevent that. Why else would lawmakers have exhausted the entire list of punishments throughout history, trying to protect themselves from evildoers? It is probable that in the early times, the penalties for the greatest offenses were less severe, but as these were disregarded, and as the death penalty became more common, even that was ignored in the exact same way. Therefore, we have two options. We must either find a punishment even more terrifying than death, or admit that laws and punishments simply do not work as a deterrent, and that as long as poverty gives men the courage of necessity, and wealth fills them with arrogant ambition, and as long as other conditions of life are controlled by some unstoppable, overwhelming passion, people will always be driven to take dangerous risks. Hope and greed, the one leading and the other following, the one conceiving the attempt, the other suggesting how easy it is to succeed, cause the greatest destruction. And although these are invisible forces, they are far stronger than the dangers that can be seen. Luck, too, powerfully helps the illusion, and by the unexpected aid that she sometimes gives, tempts men to take risks with insufficient resources. And this is especially the case with nations, because the stakes played for are the highest. And when all are acting together, each man irrationally exaggerates his own ability. In short, it is impossible to prevent, and only great naivety can hope to prevent, human nature from doing what it has once set its mind upon, by force of law or by any other deterrent force whatsoever. We must not, therefore, adopt a false policy through a belief in the effectiveness of the death punishment, or deny rebels the hope of repenting and making quick atonement of their mistake. Consider for a moment. At present, if a city that has already rebelled realizes that it cannot succeed, it will surrender while it is still able to pay some reparations and pay tribute thereafter. In the other case, what city do you think would not prepare better than is done now, and hold out to the last man against its attackers, if it is all the same whether it surrenders late or soon? And how can it be anything other than costly for us to be forced into the expense of a long siege just because the enemy's surrender is out of the question? And if we, after a long siege, capture the city, we receive the ruined town, from which we can no longer draw the revenue which forms our real strength against our enemies. Therefore, we must not sit as strict judges of the rebels to our own disadvantage, but rather see how by moderate punishment we may be able to profit in the future. And we must make up our minds to look for our protection, not to legal terrors, but to careful administration. At the present, we do exactly the opposite. When a free nation, held in subjection by force, rebels, as is only natural, and claims its independence, as soon as they are defeated, we think we have to punish them brutally, although the right approach with free people is not to punish them brutally when they do rebel, but to closely watch them before they rebel, and to prevent them from ever entertaining the idea. And once the rebellion is crushed, to hold as few people responsible for it as possible. Only consider what a blunder you would commit in doing as Cleon recommends. As things are present, in all the cities, the people are your friends, and either do not rebel with the oligarchs, or, if forced to do so, become at once the enemy of the conspirators, so that in the war with the hostile city, you have the masses on your side. But if you butcher the people of Mytilene, who had nothing to do with the rebellion, and who, as soon as they got weapons, of their own free will, surrendered the city, if you do this, first you will commit the crime of killing your benefactors, and next you will play directly into the hands of the upper classes, who, when they incite their cities to rebel, will immediately have the people on their side, because you have announced in advance the same punishment for those who are guilty and for those who are not. Even if they were guilty, you are to pretend not to notice it, in order to avoid alienating the only class still friendly to us. In short, I consider it far more useful for the preservation of our empire voluntarily to put up with injustice than to put to death, however justly, those whom it is our interest to keep alive. As for Cleon's idea that in punishment the claims of justice and self-interest can both be satisfied, facts do not confirm the possibility of such a combination. Confess, therefore, that this is the wisest course, and without conceding too much either to pity or to leniency, by neither of which motives do I, any more than Cleon, wish you to be influenced. Based purely on the clear facts of the case before you, be persuaded by me to put calmly on trial those Mytileneans whose Patres has sent off as guilty, and to leave the rest undisturbed. This is at once best for the future and most terrifying to your enemies, because good strategy against an opponent is superior to the blind attacks of brute force.
Diodotus had given his speech, and where Cleon's had been built on anger, Diodotus's was built on pragmatism and cold self-interest. We will come to a deeper analysis in a moment, but first, the assembly had to vote. Thucydides tells us it was close, But Diodotus' side won. The people were to be spared. But with that decision came an immediate problem. A ship was already at sea, carrying the death warrant. It had a full day's lead, crossing the Aegean at the ordinary pace of a crew with no particular reason to hurry. They were not racing against anything. The second trireme, dispatched immediately after the vote, carried the pardon, and the men rowing it knew exactly what they were carrying, and exactly what it meant if they were too late. Thucydides describes the crossing as extraordinary, a desperation-fueled effort that pushed the crew to the edge of what was physically possible. The first trireme was not racing, but it still arrived at Lesbos. It moored, and Paches, the Athenian commander waiting on Lesbos with the city in limbo, received the order and read it. But he had not yet acted on it when the second ship entered the harbor. They had made it. The ringleaders could not escape entirely, though. Around 1,000 men, identified by Paches as the primary architects of the rebellion. They were sent to Athens and executed. But the mass execution of the general population, the enslavement of every woman and child on the island, that was stopped. Now, back to the analysis, because the debate itself deserves a closer look. Let's start with Diodotus' speech, and the first thing to notice, the thing that makes it so remarkable, is what it is not. It is not a plea for mercy. It is not an appeal to human dignity or moral decency. Diodotus explicitly distances himself from pity. He tells the assembly he is not here to talk about justice. He is not here to make them feel guilty. He is here to talk about what is useful to Athens. So ask yourself, why? Why would someone who wants to save thousands of lives refuse to argue that those lives matter? We will come back to that question, but first, here is what he actually argued. His first move was to reframe the entire debate. Cleon had set the terms as a question of justice, and Mytilene is guilty, guilty people deserve punishment, therefore execute them. Diodotus refuses to fight on that ground. Instead, he says, "We are not a court of law, we are a political assembly. The only question worth asking is what serves Athens." Diodotus' second argument goes to the heart of Cleon's deterrence logic. Cleon had said, "Execute them all and every other city will think twice before rebelling." Diodotus says the opposite is true. If Athens kills everyone regardless of guilt, then any city that rebels in the future has no incentive to surrender. They will know that capitulation means death either way, so they may as well fight to the last man. By doing this, Athens will inherit long, ruinously expensive sieges and ruined cities that can no longer pay the tribute Athens needs to fund the war. The deterrence Cleon is after will not deter. It will make future rebellions more desperate and more costly. Diodotus' third argument is about human nature itself. No punishment, not even death, can stop people from taking risks when they believe they might succeed. Hope, greed, and the intoxication of unexpected fortune are more powerful than any law. The death penalty has never stopped crime. It will not stop a rebellion either. The only thing that actually protects the empire is good administration, giving the subject cities enough reason to stay loyal that rebellion stops being attractive. And finally, he separates the population. the common people of Mytilene had not wanted the rebellion. When they were finally given weapons, they mutinied and handed the city over to Athens. They were, in a practical sense, Athens' allies in ending the siege. To execute them, alongside the guilty oligarchs, would be to kill Athens' own friends, and to tell every other subject city that the common people have nothing to gain by siding with Athens when their rulers rebel, because they will die either way. I believe that this, on purely strategic grounds, was the stronger argument, and the assembly, given the chance to reconsider, narrowly agreed. Now, let us go one layer further, because there is something in this speech that goes beyond tactics and rhetoric. The famous classicist Jacqueline de Romilly argued that Diodotus probably did not believe his own framing. She proposed that he knew the assembly, still heated from Cleon's speech, would reject any argument based on compassion. So he disguised his appeal to humanity as an appeal to self-interest. He wrapped mercy in the language of imperial profit and loss, not because that was his true reasoning, but because it was the only reasoning the assembly would accept. And if she is right, that is already a devastating observation. It means that by 427 BC, an Athenian politician who wanted to prevent a massacre could not say so openly. He had to pretend he did not care about the people he was trying to save. We have now heard, in the last episode, Cleon's speech, and in this, Diodotus's. Now let's put them together. Let's step back and look at what the debate as a whole actually reveals. The scholar W. Robert Connor argues that Thucydides places this episode at the structural center of the history. This is the moment Athens glimpses what it is becoming and flinches. Think back to the funeral oration of 431. Pericles described a city where power was exercised with restraint, where greatness and decency had found their common expression. 2 years later, that same city votes to massacre the entire male population of a surrendered ally, and is stopped only by a second vote and a rowing race. The second vote is not driven by guilt or conscience. It is driven by expediency. The assembly does not decide that massacre is wrong. It decides that massacre is simply inconvenient. That is the shift Thucydides is charting. Not a sudden collapse of Athenian values, but a slow replacement. Idealism giving way to calculation, honor giving way to self-interest. And the language of necessity gradually expanding to justify things that would once have been unthinkable. And the cruelest detail, even the man arguing for restraint, cannot use the language of restraint. Diodotus, whoever he was, whatever he actually believed, can only save these people by agreeing, at least in public, that their lives are a means to an end. He has to speak in the only currency the assembly will accept, imperial advantage. What died with Pericles was not just a quality of leadership. It seems to have been the political environment that made the quality of leadership possible. And here's a question you can bring with you to the next episodes of this series. What happens when there is no longer a Diodotus or a Pericles? What happens when the voice arguing for restraint either does not exist or cannot make itself heard?